Hello, hello. Good morning, everyone. Welcome on today. My name is Patricia Mota, and for those of you who I have not had a chance to meet on our Facebook followers, I am the President and CEO for ACE, or the Hispanic Alliance for Career Enhancement. I hope you are staying safe and healthy and really checking in and keeping as positive of mindset as we possibly can and during these times, which we will surpass, and there will be a brighter, future for us. And thank you for joining us today. Today is the first series, Cafecito con ACE. So I hope you have your cafecito ready to go. And we want to invite individuals to share their stories on relevant topics that are going on currently. And we hope that you can join us on a weekly basis and have a conversation. ACE is a national nonprofit, and our mission is to positively impact the American workplace by providing insight, access, and professional development to both aspiring and current Latino professionals across the country. We do that by connecting our members to employment opportunities, to leadership development opportunities, and also thought leadership, so conversations such as these. And so we're fortunate today to have us a leader joining us today, a leader that has such an important mission, especially this year with the U.S. Census Bureau. And she is Erica Becker Medina. And I will ask her, let's see here, can we see you on the screen now? Hi, Erica, how are you today?
How are you? Oh, there.
There you go.
Good. How are you? Are we good? I was muted.
We are good. I can hear you now. How are you today?
I am, I'm here. I'm excited to be here. Put it that way. I'm very excited to be here. I think, we're all going through a very extraordinary situation, but events like these are great opportunities to connect, and I'm appreciative and grateful for that.
Thank you. Thank you for joining us. So before we get started and I ask you to introduce yourself and share a little bit about your background, since this is Cafecito con ACE, are you a coffee drinker? And if so,
I am definitely a coffee drinker.
Salud.
Salud. Como buena colombiana, I'm all about the coffee.
And how do you like your coffee?
So I used to just have it with milk, no sugar. But I have recently switched to black.
A healthier choice, that is. Erica, can you tell us a little bit about your background and your experience with the U.S. Census?
Yeah, so in terms of my training, my background, my degree is in economics. Mm-hmm. And I kind of came to census in this weird way because I had been using census data for my thesis, and never even occurred to me like, hey, you should apply. Instead, a professor of mine said that they were looking, he heard through one of his connections, and mm-hmm. and that's how I ended up at Census, but it was from my math professor in undergrad. So I've been at Census for, oh my goodness, close to 20 years. This will be coming up on 17 years. But what people don't realize is census, obviously the big thing is what we're doing now, the 2020 census, the decennial census. But the Census Bureau is a statistical agency and actually produces over 130 other surveys. And so it wasn't until these last 4 years that I was working on the big one, on the census of the population. But I actually started on the economic side. And the great thing about census is there's so many different surveys that it really provides kind of like that variety for your career that you wouldn't have at a smaller government agency. So I was able to work initially as a restaurant and retail analyst, mm-hmm. On a very on a big economic indicator, and then after a couple of years I went to work on public sector surveys. So I was looking at government employment and pensions, and that's where I moved up in management, was focusing on public pensions, and then from there I was working on like data user outreach and how we tell stories through data. And that was ultimately the bridge that got me to the decennial census, where I coordinate the communications for for the decennial census, or as we know it, the 2020 census. So
yeah, and before, I ask you to share a little bit more about why this year is especially important. I know we have some followers that are listening in live, and if you would, we will be capturing your questions at the very end. So please share, comment, like, all of that, emoji. If you want to add any emojis there, that's fine too. So Erica, especially for the Latino community, the Latinx community, why is it especially important this year that folks are not only taking it themselves, but that we are ourselves, advocating that others take the census?
Yeah, it's super important that we not be invisible, right?
Mm-hmm.
Because the census really boils down to two big things: political representation and resources for our communities. And so most people who know about the census, or who know a little bit about, representation in Congress, know that aspect of it, which is about apportionment, right? And so there are 435 congressional seats in the House of Representatives, and the population count is how we determine which states gain or lose a seat. And most people understand that. And that's why it's mandated in our Constitution, and we've been doing it every 10 years since 1790. But what a lot of people don't realize is the resources that our communities receive, whether that is funding for school programs like Head Start, or things that are top of mind right now, like where we need hospitals and emergency services and clinics in our communities, and things of that nature. So whether it's healthcare or schools or infrastructure like roads and bridges and public transportation, all of that is based on census figures. And so when you're not counted, when you're not represented, your community misses out. So it means that a newborn baby who's not counted, there's no resources for that child in the next 10 years, from preschool on, to after school programs, to free lunches at school, whatever the case may be. When you don't get counted, your community ends up suffering by not getting adequate and just resources.
And that's something I've been really saying a lot every time I speak about the census, is that babies count, right? So if you have little ones or babies in the household, to make sure that they're included when you do take the census. And speaking about taking the census, we do have many communities, and this is something that there's a lot of initiatives out there to ensure that we're building digital equity, right? In terms of ensuring that each household has a device, whether it be a laptop, an iPad, or but yet many of our underserved communities don't have access. So what recommendations would you have for folks that may not have access to take it online, if they choose to do, if they prefer to do it that way?
Right. So that being said, I'm glad you asked, because this has been the easiest, it's never been easier than now to respond to the census on your own, right? So way before there was any sign of a pandemic, one of the principal things of our design was to make it easy for everyone to respond. And so, yes, it's the first time that we're giving that option for everyone to go online. But it's important to note that not everyone, like you said, not everyone has access or connectivity. Or some people have connectivity, but they may have second thoughts about doing it that way. So we ensured that we would provide alternatives. And so people can also respond over the phone, or they can also do it by mail. And that's also how we are supporting more than 99% of the languages spoken in the households, meaning, we have, I'm so sorry about that. We have, in addition to English and Spanish, English and Spanish and more languages. So 13 languages, including English and Spanish, for the online questionnaire, as well as phone support. And in terms of people who want to do it the old-fashioned way, paper and pencil and mail it back. So a segment of the population, about just over 20% of the households in this country received their paper questionnaire in that very first mailing that they received. But we did that because it was a data-driven design, and we did that in areas that we already knew based on our American Community Survey data, that those areas had what we say less propensity to respond online, right? Whether it's connectivity or demographics. And so upfront, we mailed paper questionnaires to a segment of the population, about 1 in 5 households. And now, starting April, so today, April 8th, so between now and April 16th, the remaining households who have yet to respond will receive that paper questionnaire in their 4th mailing.
What would you say are the biggest fears or concerns with folks not taking the census, and what would your response be to that?
So my response is not to fear, not to be afraid of the census. It's the best thing you can do for your community. Not to be afraid, because the census does not share your data with anyone. That means we aren't allowed to share it with other government agencies. By law, your data are protected. It's US Title 13. So there's a law in place that says census cannot share the data, not with ICE, not with the police, not with any government agency, with no one. So by law, we can't share the data, and by law, the data may not be used against you. So I just reiterate that and ask people to remind everyone of that, that we do not share the data, nor can we. We're bound by law, and we all take a lifetime oath, and there's stiff penalties, $250,000, 5 years in prison for employees who if anyone were to violate that.
Thank you. So as we were, April 1st being last week being, Census Day, there's a lot of promotion, a lot of conversation out there regarding the census. And I was in a lot of group text messages, and one of the biggest questions that kept popping up or comments was regarding the race question, right, for our community, regarding, well, which one do I select, or I do not identify, so I'm just going to select other. What is your response to that in terms of the race question that's on there?
Yeah, I think I recognize the confusion, so I want to say that. But I think at the end of the day, we need to remind people that it's about how we self-identify. So census is never in a position to tell anyone what they should or should not select. That's not our job. As a federal agency, we have to use the categories that are actually created by the Office of Management and Budget. And so that's, people often don't realize, they think because it comes from the census, we must be creating these categories. But we have to follow the federal categories that are already in place by a different agency, by OMB. So there's that. And then we just remind people that it's how you self-identify. So that's why we give the option to fill in, to write in a response if you don't identify with any of them. So some people may, they have the option, if they choose white or black or Asian, to describe their, I think with more specificity.
With the other?
And that as well, right? And that's what I mean. So even within those other categories, you can describe, to be more specific, or if you still just don't identify with any of them, that's what we have the some other race for. And you can also fill it out below the some other race, what race you would identify with.
So to our Facebook followers that are out there, be curious to hear from you. If you can respond or comments, or what did you respond, or what was your experience like filling that out? Because I know I've had a lot of interesting conversations last week about that. So before we start taking any other questions from our audience, and we'll start that shortly, what other advice do you have? I mean, currently, given the current times, a lot of us are working remotely or stuck at home indoors, spending a lot of time indoors, to really not just the census, but really be an advocate for a lot of the issues in our community from home. What advice or suggestions would you have?
In terms of for advocacy?
Yeah, absolutely.
In terms of for advocacy, yeah. So what we're asking people to do is, once you respond to the census and you've done your part to respond, now help us spread the word, and please tell your friends, tell your family, spread the word through your social media networks, whatever those networks are, it's not just telling people, hey, fill it out. It's saying, hey, fill it out, and it's important, and here's why. And so those messages, those principal messages about the importance, about the resources for our community. I mean, people may not make the connection, but scientists actually use census data and census population statistics for these mathematical models precisely to see, the spread of viruses or infectious diseases and how they affect the community and the resources that are needed. So it's more important than ever. It's always important, but I think right now, given the situation that we're in, it should really resonate for people why it's so important to know where people are and where those services are needed. So we're just asking people to spread the word. Once you respond, emphasize the importance and that the data are safe, and we are not allowed to share it with anybody.
Yeah, and that we're currently living an example of the impact that could
exactly
have, right? Thank you for that. So we have a couple of questions here, and it says, this is from Eusebio Islas. Hello, Eusebio. It says, what U.S. Census formula is used to account for the disproportionate need in underserved communities, since population alone, which is true, does not guarantee equity? So it's a long-winded, so the question is, what formula is used to account for the need in the communities?
So to be clear,
yeah.
The Census Bureau doesn't determine the funding or the resources that are allocated to the communities, right? We know that more than $675 billion of federal funding are allocated annually. And that's the census figure, but other stakeholders have actually estimated larger amounts than, less conservative than census. So it's important to understand the difference. Census provides the data by carrying out this count of the population, but it's policymakers and other governments, meaning at the local, state, and federal level, who determine exactly, the funding based on the census counts. So we don't do formulas for allocating the funding, if that makes sense. We help inform those decisions by providing the data.
Right. And then those decisions are made
by policymakers, by your governments, exactly. And so it's really, I think it really depends on each local government, right? And are they,
yeah, which is important that, this being an election year as well, that we are getting out there and voting, right? There's a lot of pieces to the puzzle when it comes to building more of an equitable society. And this is a piece of it, right? A big piece of it, important, along with voting, not only locally for your own local elections, but also for the federal national elections as well. Hi, Michael Hernandez. Good that you're tuning in. We have a few folks on there saying hello. So Erica, before we wrap up, and any advice, whether you would give, I mean, you're a successful Latina in your own right, and a lot of the work that we do is also feature and shine a light in other leaders within our community. So what would you say is a piece of advice that you received, that you've implemented and utilized throughout your career trajectory, or a resource that you can share with our audience?
So, I was thinking about this when you sent me that question, and the advice I got long time ago, at the time applied to when I was in college, but I've used it throughout my career, in that long time ago when I was still deliberating, what degree or what major I was going to focus on. A colleague of mine who, this was at a job that I had while I was in school, and he had already finished school, and he said, Erica, it really doesn't matter. I mean, obviously for some degrees it does, whether you're a doctor or an engineer, but for other degrees that are less specific, he was saying it really doesn't matter what your degree is in. If you're good, people will train you, right? And so I would say that advice kind of stuck with me, and I've used it throughout my career, in that I don't let myself get pigeonholed, right? So people may think because I'm currently chief of the Decennial Communications Coordination Office, that my background is in communications. It's not. My background's in economics, and I actually worked for over a dozen years as a survey statistician at the Census Bureau. But if you're good at what you do, in this case, it was being able to analyze data and articulate about that data. Well, then, that's how I ended up in communications. And so really just not pigeonholing yourself and not limiting yourself. I think if you do your best in your job, certain skills will pop out and people will notice them, and you can take those on to other jobs instead of getting stuck in one position.
I think, and that's especially important for our young professionals, our students in college, right? To really reflect on that. Thank you for sharing. I think it's a wonderful piece of advice. Thank you for joining us for our first Cafecito con ACE Live. Salud. I appreciate your time and your insights, and we look forward to continuing to engage with you with ACE. And so with that, gracias, Erika. And to all of you out there, please continue to send any messages that you have out there, any questions that you have as well. Please join us next week at the same time on Tuesdays as well. We'll be featuring both Olga Camargo, Juan Carlos Avila, many friends of ours out there, and specifically talking about your retirement during this time with the coronavirus and the impact that it has, and some strategic tips for you to be aware of. And then also us is providing other webinars following this Cafecito. We also have a webinar talking about tips for working from home, which many of us are. So please join us as well. And with that, thank you to everyone. Please like, share, comment, and we look forward to seeing you next week. Hasta luego. Bye-bye.